No, you're okay.
Hi, everyone. This is Pat Burke again. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar on RAD FHA Connection. Our first speaker will be Robert Robinson, who will do an overview of the RAD program. Then I will talk briefly about the approval process for RAD FHA Deals. And lastly, Scott Gruhl, who's with us in D.C. today, will go into some more depth on FHA underwriting of RAD deals. So with that, I'll let Robert begin.
Good. Thank you. See if everyone's on the line and can hear it.
Can everyone on the line hear us?
They can't speak.
Okay.
Oh, they can't speak.
So just to that point, so this is Robert Robinson, so thank you all for joining us. I know we've got lots of people from lots of different places, and we've got some recap folks and some multifamily folks and lots of different folks. So if you've not done a GoToMeeting before, one thing to remember is that you're on mute until you raise your hand, at which point in time I can unmute you. But in order to unmute you, you have to have entered in your audio pin. If you're listening at your computers and you don't have a microphone, you can't talk and you can't ask a question. So if you do have questions and you're in that situation, please feel free to type them in the question section, but we really prefer to have questions by people raising their hands. So if you could do that, that would be great. We are recording this presentation, so for anybody who wants to listen to it again or just can't get enough of RAD and FHA, or those that have missed it, you can certainly get this later. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with kind of an overview of the RAD and FHA, kind of the beginning of RAD, what RAD's all about. I know a lot of you have already had this presentation and have probably heard it a million times, so I apologize, and I'll try not to spend too long on it. But as with a lot of things, it's sometimes good to set the stage for everybody as you go through this. So RAD is a public housing conversion process, and so what is public housing? What does public housing look like? So those of you who are familiar with the public housing inventory, there are some million-plus public housing units across 3,100 PHAs across the country. A housing authority may be a city, it could be a county, and in some states there are actually state housing authorities. So you get a mix of different public bodies, but all of those have one thing in common, which is they own the underlying real estate that the apartment complex and the complex itself is on. So unlike the subsidized world that the FHA underwriters and those in recap and other places are used to dealing with, where you have private owners with government subsidy, these are actually owned by the housing authorities. And the way that they get subsidy is through the federal government's direct grants. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how that works. But that's the main distinction as we're talking through these RAD conversions. It's the ownership of the property going from a public body and being funded directly to being funded by a subsidy platform that we're more used to. One of the reasons that RAD came about and why RAD is so important to the public housing inventory is because through cuts and different ways that public housing has been dealt with over the years, capital improvements at the properties have been overlooked. So there was a study done, and while RAD's been around since about 2012, there was a study done back in 2010, so it's a little bit old but still relevant, that showed that there was an excess of almost $2,400 a unit in capital repairs that were necessary. Sorry, $24,000 a unit in capital repairs that were necessary on these projects. And without more federal money, there was no way for these improvements to be done. And so each year, public housing authorities would do their best to deal with the capital needs of all of their properties, but they were at the mercy of the federal government, who, as we all know, have been continuing to cut budgets across the board, and public housing being one of them. And so the idea of RAD was to find a way that public housing authorities could tap the private sector and get these capital needs addressed. So the other piece that's on this slide that I wanted to mention was public housing was also, because things were so aged, public housing was losing between 5,000 to 10,000 units a year. And so in already a dwindling affordable housing inventory, public housing was getting cut as well. Also, RAD wanted to address, which we're not going to spend too much time on this call, but did want to address some of the legacy multifamily programs. The mod rehab, rent sub for app programs, all of which are fairly well, I'll say one of the successes of RAD, fairly well contained now. Rent up and wrap over the last 4 years have almost been fully refinanced and moved on to a more stable PBRA platform. And mod rehab, I think that the department's down to about 120 mod rehabs still left in inventory. So that has been very successful for RAD. So that's something that's been very well done. That's a second component. You hear people talk about the RAD first component, the RAD second component. RAD second component was to deal with these legacy programs. The first component was the public housing inventory. So as I mentioned, a couple of key goals for the RAD program. One is to build on the proven Section 8 platform. So the PBRA and PPP programs have got a tremendous following, particularly PBRA and asset management and management of properties. The PPP platform and the voucher programs established, but certainly getting more established. And I think that RAD is helping to have that established even more so. But two very strong platforms, ones that Congress has been able to understand and things that have been successful over the years. And also a way for public housing authorities to tap the capital markets, whether they're borrowing from a lender or whether they're using FHA insurance to borrow or whether they're using tax credits. So we're going to talk about all those things today. And also for a resident, it also creates an opportunity for them to not only live in better housing because the capital improvements are going to be done, but also provides them greater choice and mobility through the choice mobility exemptions that we're going to talk about. The PPP programs allow movement within a geographic area. So we're going to talk about that a little bit today. So what's it look like? This slide has changed dramatically over time, and there was actually at one point we kind of walked through kind of how we got here, which a slide that I took out. But RAD was created in 2012. The initial demo program was 60,000 units. 2015, that was expanded to 185,000 units. And then earlier this month, it was expanded to 225,000 units. So where things stand today is you've got the 185,000 units that have all been brought into the program, of which 62,000 of those have already closed. So about a third of the authority has been converted already. The balance of those are in some stage of underwriting and conversion, which is kind of what we're talking about here. So obviously one of the reasons for this training and for this call is to deal with the fact that there are a ton of units and properties that are still moving through the RAD inventory. And then with the expansion of the authority from 185,000 to 225,000, those properties in the lower part of this chart that are on the waiting list, 40,000 of those are going to move to active status within the next 60 or 90 days. So recap is going to be processing about 120,000 units over the next 18 months, a number of which are going to be FHA insured. How much of those will be FHA insured? So to date, the RAD program has closed about 15% have used FHA insurance. This is a little bit lower than what was originally anticipated. I think that by most counts, people thought a third to a half would use FHA insurance. For a variety of reasons, that's not come to fruition. But in the current pipeline, it's still about 20 to 25% is what they anticipated. I'm not entirely sure with the new 40,000 what the makeup will be of those, but certainly the trend has been fairly stable at about 20% over the last year and a half. The makeup of that, most of the RAD transactions are using the D4 platform, so a new construction or more substantial rehab. They're not as many Fs as some people had thought. There was originally an idea that it might be a split between the two, more 50-50, 60-40, but it really is more 80-20, if not 90-10 in favor of the D4s. So what does RAD do for a PHA? Well, the RAD program offers PHAs a way to move to a more market-driven process. PHAs are moving away from managing their properties as an entire entity and having to move money inside of their organization to service one property or not to the detriment of another. In this particular case, with the RAD conversion, each property is created to stand alone. And that property, through the RAD conversion process, has a capital needs assessment, physical condition assessment, whatever term of art you use in your world, but an analysis of what the property looks like today, what sort of rehab is necessary to bring it up to standard, and then what rehab over the next 20 years will be needed to keep it at that standard. And so PHAs are being required to create a vision of single asset management. While they'll still be, in some cases, portfolio owners, they'll not be moving money around to help one property to the detriment of another. Each property will be funded at a level that makes them viable, and then reserve accounts funded at a level that makes them viable. It also offers an opportunity, which they've not had before, to tap the FHA world. In the past, public housing authorities were not traditionally not able to borrow money, but now they can, and some will use the FHA platform to do that. The other piece, of which probably 40% of RAD transactions to date have had some form of tax credits involved in them. This is a very popular platform. Also FHA and LIHTC, also a popular platform, but this is a way to really get some substantial rehab dollars into these properties. And then the last point on this slide we talked about, which is streamlining the legacy programs, and again, this is well underway and almost finished actually, which is very nice. So how does a PHA get into the RAD program? It's a voluntary program, so PHAs have to apply. As you saw from an earlier slide, there are enough active transactions and available authority to where there's actually a waiting list. So RAD has been very popular over the years. Transactions do fall out for whatever reason. The PHA decides to take another approach, or they can't make it financially viable, or something else happens, and so there's constant turn on the waiting list. But it is voluntary, so first come, first serve. You get in line and you get awarded a CHAP. The 225,000 unit cap that was set by Congress most recently, there's also been some talk about removing the cap altogether. This is still a demo program, so there's still lots of learning that's being done and lots of different things explored. So I would imagine that at the moment, Congress will leave the 225 number for a little while. The long-term nature of these contracts is something that is hugely powerful for PHAs. The ability to have a rent number that they're going to know for the next 20 years. One of the unique features of RAD is that the rents are set based on, and we're going to look at the rent setting in a minute, but the rents are set through their HAP contract, and then they're adjusted by an OCAF every year. And so the PHA knows what their income stream is. They can borrow against that income stream. And then, more importantly for the residents and for the PHAs as well, there's a clause in the HAP contract, that in a RAD HAP contract, where the Secretary will offer and the PHA will accept an extension. So this is almost an in perpetuity HAP contract for the RAD program, which is nice. I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide, but just know that public housing authorities can come into RAD and then they determine which Section 8 platform they want to go into, whether they want to go into PBRA or PBV. There are advantages and disadvantages in each. We're not going to spend a lot of time thinking about that, but there are different ways for PHAs to get into the RAD program. Rent setting. This is important to understand, but for those of you who are FHA underwriters and are used to dealing with typical HAP contracts, you don't want to get too hung up on how the numbers were created, other than to know that there are economics behind how these numbers are set up. In the public housing world, the rents are established with three buckets, one of which is the tenant portion. So how much can the tenant pay? So a tenant can pay 30% of their income. That's the amount that they pay and no more. That's actually the same when they convert to PBRA or PBV. So the tenant portion of this doesn't change. The other pieces are a little bit different. So in public housing, Congress provides to each housing authority a capital grant and an operating fund grant. And so the operating fund money is based on the historical operations of the properties in the PHA's inventory. So how much does it cost to operate all of them? So if it's a housing authority of one property, that's pretty simple. If it's a housing authority of 50 or 60, that's a little more complicated. But those operating funds are try through a formula to portion out each amount for each property. So they try to make sure that each property gets the amount of money that they deserve from an operating standpoint. Capital is where it gets a little bit more squishier. So basically what Congress looks at in their formula is they look at what the capital needs over the entire inventory of the PHA is and then provide some diminished number of that, saying, well, we can't give you everything you need, but hopefully we can give you enough. And so what happened in the RAD conversions was that capital fund money was split across all of the AMPs fairly evenly. Not trying to determine, since they didn't really know, since there are no capital needs assessments done on these properties in the way that multifamily looks at them, they have to look at it a different way, and so they don't have enough specific information on the property, so they kind of guess. But those two pieces are then combined into one stream, which would be your HAP payment. So no longer will a PHA have operating and capital funds commingled, but they'll have one number, the subsidy number that they're going to use moving forward. So that's kind of how these numbers were created, how these rents are set. Most everyone, I think, is probably fairly familiar with PBRA and how the PBRA contracts work. Under RAD, it's not that much different. A couple of things of note, that the 20-year term of the use agreement is then renewed through what I just mentioned before, which is kind of the secretary will offer and the owner will accept the next 20 years. So you're really ingraining this as affordable housing moving forward. For PBRA, the annual appropriations typically are fairly well founded, and that's very different for public housing. Public housing is used to being cut every year, so they always ask for more, and they never get it. And so that game playing, if you will, it goes away in the RAD program. The other piece of this that's unique through RAD is the choice mobility option. So the choice mobility option for housing authorities that administer PBV contracts already, they have a choice mobility option built into their program, and thus their tenants will have the opportunity to get on waiting lists and move to different housing if they so choose. It's something unique to PBV, unique to the RAD program to apply this to a PBRA contract, which typically does not have this. So a PBRA contract, there's no ability for the tenants to leave with a voucher, if you will. They can leave the property, of course, but they can't take their assistance with them. And there's no income mixing requirement for these properties. So that's those kind of unique features for PBRA and RAD. Similarly, for a PBV in RAD, there are some general terms that are still in place. The HQS inspection standard stays in place. I actually believe I should have taken the last one off, the 50% of property supported services mandatory. I don't think that's in the new notice, but it may be. A lot of housing authorities provide supportive services at their property, and the RAD requirement initially was to maintain that, but I'm not sure if that one's still in place. But nothing really necessarily unique through RAD and RAD PBVs. So as I mentioned, getting into the RAD program is first come, first serve. The housing authority must maintain ownership of control of the property through the RAD conversion. If they own the property coming out, they're fine. If they move it into a tax credit transaction, from which they have a controlling interest, or they have a ground lease on the property, those are fine. But through the RAD program, the PHA has to maintain some type of ownership control, unless it's moving to a nonprofit, in which case nonprofits are acceptable. So some of the transactions that you see where the PHA is either creating a nonprofit or joint venturing with a nonprofit, those are all acceptable ownership and control items in RAD. The contract term, PBRA, is going to be 20 years. For PBV, the PHA can choose either 15 or 20 years, whichever one they prefer. Contract rents in the PBRA world, PHAs can have up to 120% of FMRs without a rent comp study. If their initial rents would fall in the band that goes past 120%, so their existing subsidy would be above that, they can get a rent comp study that would then support anything above up to 150% of FMRs. Believe it or not, there are some cases where housing authorities were receiving current subsidy in those levels, and they've applied that and gotten those rents and maintained them. On the PBV side, it's 100% of FMRs is the cap or their rent reasonableness, which each PHA does on their own. For capital and operating funds, again, those are being used in the financing of the RAD conversion, but they'll no longer be receiving those once they convert through RAD. They'll be getting HAP contract payments. The HAP contracts are going to be OCAF'd. They have to have a long-term long-term use agreement in place, and as I mentioned, the contract renewal is going to be on a 20-year basis. I talked about the choice of mobility and the PBV inventory. So the housing authorities have typically only been allowed to use 20% of their inventory with PBVs. Now they can be exempt from that, so the property can have more PBVs at the property than they normally could, up to 50 or 100%. So the property can go from 20% to 100% PBV with no problem. A lot of these other items that are waived, important to note that there's no rescreening at conversion. So if a tenant currently living in the property at RAD conversion, they can stay at the property for at least the first year, at which point in time they're going to have to requalify, but no one can be kicked out of a RAD property. Furthermore, if a property is being vacated for renovations, the current tenant has to be given the right to return to that property. They can waive that right to return to the property, but they have to be the ones to do that, and they have to be the ones to decide that they're not going to come back. Also an important note, since housing authorities are subject to Davis-Bacon, in the public housing world, any initial work that's done at the property must be subject to Davis-Bacon wages. Moving forward, they will not, because there'll be PBRA and PBV contracts don't require that, but going in, any rehab that's being done is required to be Davis-Bacon waged. I'm not going to spend any time on that one. So what are the different options, and what are we seeing in the RAD conversions? So certainly conventional debt, soft debt, credit enhancements. Fannie Mae has a product that's being used a lot. FHA insurance is being used a lot. Tax credits are being used a lot. Interestingly enough, there are a number of PHAs that are using no debt. They've accumulated enough capital over the years to be able to rehab the property and set the property up for the next 20 years without borrowing any money. One of the things and advantages of doing that, particularly some of these smaller mid-sized PHAs, is that once those conversions happen, all of the money that they use that's converted is defederalized, which means that they are no longer restricted on how they use the money. They have to use it for affordable housing purposes, and the mission is a public housing authority. But there's no approval that they have to come back to public housing or HUD for using those funds. So we've seen a number of housing authorities that have gone through RAD conversion and are now developing additional affordable housing with the money that they're able to take out of their operating and capital reserves, which is great. Pat's going to spend some time talking about the RAD process, but basically the way any project moves through RAD is the PHA applies for the transaction to come into RAD. There's a review of their application. If it passes very certain thresholds, then it sits in the queue on the waiting list. When there's availability, then a CHAP is issued. Once the CHAP is issued by HUD, then certain requirements start kicking into place. The most important of which is that in 180 days from CHAP issuance, the PHAs are required to submit a financing plan. Financing plan is basically, for those of you who are doing FHA underwriting, is an application for firm commitment. In fact, for RAD FHA transactions, as soon as the PHA submits, as soon as the lender submits their firm application to you, that is supposed to be simultaneously when the PHA submits their financing plan. So those two dates should be the same. RAD then goes through their underwriting process. A RAD conversion commitment is issued. That's what signifies the approval of the RAD conversion, and then things move to closing. For an FHA RAD transaction, that our RAD conversion commitment is issued at the same time or slightly after the FHA firm. So the PHA moves out of public housing onto the Section 8 platform. So as soon as either the construction is finished or the conversion happens, the HAP contract goes into effect. All of the units are removed from public housing. The declaration of trust on the property is released. The use agreement goes in first position. Everything's subordinate to that, and they're no longer in public housing. There is a section on the HUD website, HUD.gov/RAD, that provides a lot of RAD information. There's also a RAD resource desk. For those of you who are not familiar with it, you should definitely log on. You should go there, radresource.net. I'll go up later in the presentation. I'm sure I'll go take a look at that with you all. But that's something that you're going to want to know and get more information about various pieces and guidance there. So let's see if we have any questions before I hand it off. No questions at the moment. On. I'm ready.
Okay,
Go
so
for it.
you talked about PHA using money after conversion to possibly build other affordable housing or for admission. It has to, or does it still have to be the last project that they can take some additional funds out, or can they do it over the course of converting their entire portfolio?
So Anna's question is, I mentioned that when PHA converts a property, they can take some of the potential quote-unquote excess funds and use them for other affordable housing purposes. And she was asking if that meant that it had to be the last property in the PHA's inventory or not. It does not have to be the last property in the PHA's inventory. If the property shows reserves affiliated with that property that are in excess of the needs of the property, the PHA can quote-unquote cash out and take some of that money out. And there are some PHAs that are doing that. What they can't do is they can't cash out their entire capital fund account. For example, if I'm a PHA that has 20 properties and I'm converting one, and my capital fund allocation for the year was $20 million, I can't take $20 million out for that for one property. Okay. You could take $1 million, proportionate, right? Maybe 1.5. It's subject to RECAP and PIH's approval, but within reason. But the transactions that I have seen where that has been done, it's been, you know, $1 million, $1.5 million, so something that's proportional to that. So it adds up. Operating funds are different. So operating reserves do tend to be more tied with the property. So if a property has a significant operating reserve, they can typically take all of that. But it's not going to be at the magnitude of a capital deposit.
I have a question about the vouchers that can transfer out. They're 10 or 15%. The resident can leave and with the voucher, is that what you're saying?
So the way choice mobility works, right? So if a PHA, so this would be unique to a PBRA world because PBVs you already have the ability to do that. So in a conversion where the housing authority is a PBV administrator and they're converting the property to PBRA, which doesn't have the choice mobility option in it, they must provide to the tenants at that property the ability to voucher themselves out. So they have to provide that. They don't have to. There's some language around it. They have to stay in. The tenant has to stay in the property for 18 months. You know, that sort of stuff. But unlike other PBRA properties, they do have that choice mobility option after conversion.
So the tenant would do a tenant-based voucher.
It would get either, you know, they could have a tenant protection voucher. They could have a housing choice voucher. They could have something else. They have the ability to leave to go to another property, right?
And there's no
Correct. That's correct. The PBRA contract stays the same. That's exactly right. That they don't take, unlike a PVV where they would take it with them to another property, they would not do that. That's exactly right. Yeah. All right. Just check and see if I have any questions. All right, no questions. Great. So that was an overview. And now I'm going to let Pat talk about specifics. All right, Pat.
Okay, everybody, the RAD FHA approval process. First, we'll briefly go over a couple of RAD terms. The chap, which Robert just mentioned, kind of begins the RAD approval process, and it's a commitment to enter into a HAP. It basically says HUD will issue PBV or PBRA HAP contracts provided the PHA meets the RAD requirements. It gives the PHA the RAD rent for each unit type. And this is important because when an FHA underwriter gets the application for firm, the CHAP is presumably attached to that with the RAD rent and also with the PIC number, which I will mention shortly. Lastly, the CHAP, and we do see this quite a bit, can be amended to reconfigure unit types, add units, or split the CHAP into 2 CHAPs. In some cases, maybe even 3 CHAPs. And that can make it confusing, I know. Almost all, and maybe all RAD deals have what we call a kickoff call, which is similar to the FHA concept call, and it's held shortly after the PHA receives their CHAP. I should note that these kickoff calls are done by transaction managers whom we call readiness transaction managers, and we contract out for those. Those are not the transaction manager that will take over once the financing plan is committed. And of course, the kickoff call includes internal and external persons. The financing plan, which is what must come into the RAD office 180 days after the CHAP. If it doesn't, we have to extend the CHAP. If things go really awry and it's just not happening, we will sometimes revoke the CHAP, which means if they come back in, they have to get back on the waiting list. So the financing plan for an FHA application is basically the FHA application. The financing plan, the FHA app are one and the same. They should be submitted at the same time, and there are a few additional items that the PHA must include if it's a RAD deal. You can see those on the slide. Accessibility and relocation plan checklist, the significant amendment to the public housing plan, the list of non-dwelling unit features in the public housing property, evidence that the PHA has applied for removal from PIC, and the subsidy layering review, if applicable. And note here, I start PIC. PIC is the public housing system that tracks public housing properties. It's a system run by PIH, and it's basically the only way that the RAD team has of identifying a property. So especially when we have an FHA property, the RAD property is most of the time called one name, and the FHA firm application has another name. So we are always asking you to send either myself or the TM, if you know who the TM is, notice when you get in an application for firm for a RAD deal, and send us the PIC number so we'll know which deal we're talking about. The RAD FHA timeline. I think this is fairly, you see our little step chart, fairly self-explanatory. After CHAP issuance, the RAD kickoff call happens. At more or less the same time, if it's a D4, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have concept meetings or calls for every single deal, but since most of the RAD deals are D4s, there'll probably be a concept meeting, right?
Yeah, I think we're recommending that we have a concept meeting for any RAD.
For any
FHA
RAD
transaction,
FHA. Okay, that's good to know.
Tend to be more difficult, but that's something that I'll be
Oh,
suggesting.
RAD is easy. We all know that. So the PHA has 6 months to get in their financing plan, which is also the FHA firm. The next step is that the TM, the financing plan TM, reviews the plan and takes the deal to either to RAD Approval Committee or it's approved by the director of the transaction team. It's important to note that because that should happen first before the FHA underwriter goes to the FHA loan committee. After the FHA loan committee, obviously within a few days or whatever it takes, the FHA underwriter, the office, issues the firm commitment. As Robert just said, that should be the RAD Approval Committee and the FHA Loan Committee should be very close in time, and hopefully the RAD PM and the FHA underwriter have been talking to each other because the RAD Approval Committee always wants to know where we are with the firm, and the firm, the FHA Loan Committee, wants to know that the RAD transaction has been approved. Next, once the RAD office has the firm commitment, and not until then, Tom Davis or his delegatee signs the RCC, which then goes to the PHA and is countersigned by them, so it is fully executed. And finally, the RAD conversion and FHA closing take place simultaneously, because the FHA closing is the financing closing for the RAD transaction. All right, onward. I think this is really just kind of a repeat of the chart, but I guess it doesn't hurt to repeat it because there's been a lot of confusion out there as to which comes first. So first we have the RAD Approval Committee or delegated approval. Then the RAD TM issues the FHA addendum, which basically says that the RAD committee or our division director has approved the RAD deal. Then the TM completes the RCC template. The FHA firm is issued. The RCC is issued by recap, and then the RCC is executed by the PHA and returned to HUD. At that point, the deal is set. So in terms of who should be doing what between the RAD TM and the FHA underwriter, we assign a transaction manager, basically a readiness transaction manager at CHAP issuance. The RAD TM, once the financing plan comes in, if it's an FHA deal, they focus on non-underwriting aspects of the transaction. They are not in any way attempting to re-underwrite an FHA deal. FHA has been around a long time, and FHA rules will govern. The TM assures that RAD policies are complied with, because there are quite a few policies beyond what FHA would need. They gather the necessary interdepartmental approvals, which include FHEO and PIH and sometimes others. They provide the program document reviews to the FHA underwriter. They ideally should participate in the FHA concept call. We've had some trouble coordinating that, but if the underwriter tells us that an FHA concept call for a RAD deal is going to happen on May 29th at 2 o'clock, and the TM gets that information, we would like the TM to be sitting in and be present at that conference call. The RAD TM lastly issues the restructuring commitment and transitions the transaction to the RAD closing coordinator. At that point, the RAD closing coordinator quarterbacks the RAD closing process, getting final signatures on all those interdepartmental documents, and coordinates with the FHA closing coordinator, who's simultaneously looking at the FHA end of things. So the FHA underwriters' activities, you guys should begin to coordinate with the RAD TM at the FHA concept meeting. You should certainly coordinate with the TM by the time of firm application. You obviously focus on financial underwriting and the MAP guide, ensuring that FHA guidelines are followed. You coordinate with the RAD TM and the RAD TM's presentation to RAD Approval Committee, who, as I said again, but I'll repeat, always want to know exactly where the firm commitment application is in the process. And then the FHA closing coordinator quarterbacks the FHA closing process and coordinates the closing with the recap. So in terms of roles and responsibilities, which you've probably figured out by now, the RAD TM, their job is to understand the RAD rules, the RAD portion of the transaction. They know the PHA. They do not underwrite the RAD financing plan if it's an FHA deal. They coordinate all the other RAD approvals that are necessary, such as FHEO and PIH. They present to the RAD Approval Committee, or in the case of delegation, to the transaction division director, and they prepare the RAD FHA addendum after that committee and get it off to the FHA underwriter. The FHA underwriter evaluates the FHA application just the way they evaluate any other application, looking at rehab needs, financing, credit, everything else you guys look at, which is extensive, I know. You have the relationship with the FHA lender. There shouldn't be any need for the RAD TM to be talking to the FHA lender. You underwrite, this is kind of a repeat, the FHA firm application. Important to note, you complete the Part 50 environmental review. The FHA production staff always does that for the FHA firm when it's a RAD deal or when it's not a RAD deal. It doesn't matter. That's up to FHA. And then, of course, you present to the FHA loan committee, assuming that the deal has already been presented to the RAD loan committee. We were asked to include something on RAD FHA risk sharing, which we're seeing more often these days. This timeline is very similar to what we did for RAD FHA, except After the RAD Approval Committee or delegated approval, FHA issues the firm approval letter, which I believe goes to the HFA, who's actually done the underwriting. Then we see a copy of that letter. We execute the RCC, and once again, the RAD conversion or FHA loan and FHA loan closing occur. As far as risk share goes, I would say the RAD TM responsibilities are exactly the same, and I don't think I need to repeat them. For risk share, the FHA field office evaluates the HFA package because they've been the underwriter and they submit the package. They're going to risk share on the lending side. They complete the HUD retained reviews, which I won't repeat. I think you can, we'll be sending out copies of these PowerPoints so you can refer to those, but all the FHA underwriters know which reviews they do on a risk share deal. Note that as usual, they do the environmental review in the case of legal incapacity of the HFA. That's never a RAD responsibility. They issue the firm approval letter and they coordinate the loan closing. Last but not least, here are our FHA senior underwriters in various regional offices. Barbara Listokin in New York, Scott Gruel in Chicago, Kenneth Bird in Fort Worth, and Kathy Brewer in Atlanta. And I'd like to give them all a big shout out for basically creating this PowerPoint with me and for being great to work with through this whole RAD FHA liaison process. They get a lot of phone calls from me. Thank you very much, guys. Question from Anawa.
Oh, okay. My question is the Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plan. Right now, it is not on the FHEO tab. So when it's the FHA deal, does the underwriter still handle the coordination with the local FHEO office for that?
Yeah, so Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plans have been in and out of favor as far as recap and the RAD conversion process. For a while, no one wanted them prior to closing. Then people did want them prior to closing. They wanted them approved prior to closing. And not, so basically, it's come back to what I believe is the standard FHA practice, which is Affirmative Fair Housing Marketing Plans have to be submitted, but they don't have to be approved prior to closing.
They have to be approved prior to marketing.
Right.
At least that's what I've been told by FHEO. So
Yours do. So Scott's saying that for FHA, they have to be approved prior to closing. That's an FHA requirement. That's
okay, well,
fine.
that's
Well,
good.
now, aren't they
But let's stop right there. That's good to answer. Scott just said for an FHA deal, the Affirmative Housing Fair Marketing Plan does have to be approved before closing. In the case of a RAD deal that's not FHA, it does not have to be approved prior to closing. It has to be approved before the new owner can market the property.
Well, because it's an attachment to the HAP contract, don't they all have to be approved
No.
prior to closing? Okay.
But for purposes of this webinar, they do, because we're talking FHA deals. Any other questions?
So I've got some, hold on, I've got a couple of questions here, so I'm going to, if I can.
But it's not a, it's a condition of the firm, so it doesn't have to be approved in order for the firm to be issued.
I mean, we generally like for it to be, but it can be a condition, yeah.
Okay.
So we have a couple of written questions.
What is the RAD FHA addendum? Robert, I'll let you answer that.
So the RAD FHA addendum is simply a different version of the RAD approval memo. So I'm not sure who was asking that question. Is that Tanya? Yeah, so it's just a different version of the RAD approval memo, and it's found on the RAD resource desk. So the other question was, Where do you anticipate seeing efficiencies to meet the RAD expansion identified in the 2018 budget? I don't think that recap needs any more efficiencies. They can meet the expansion in the budget with current capacity. So there hasn't been a lack of capacity on the RAD conversions. That's not been an issue with moving transactions through. Let's see if we got any more. All right, that looks like all the questions we have at the moment. Oh, here we go. Why would a PHA choose a PBV of 15 years instead of 20 years? So most of the time, PBV, 15-year PBV contracts are chosen because they want to do a 15-year loan. The RAD requirement is that there are no balloon payments prior to 20 years, it's 18 years or the term of the HAP contract. And so for a PBV contract, PBV 15-year contract would allow for a 15-year balloon payment. So that's when you would see that happen. But like the questioner asks, I don't know why you would do it either. I've always wondered why. What debt is on the 85% not FHA? I'm not sure what the question is.
Well, conventional debt, it could be one of the GSEs, Fannie or Freddie. It could be Citibank, which does a lot of affordable housing, and maturity and rate. Many of those GSE loans actually do have balloon payments, but they also are very closely underwritten by Fannie or Freddie for refinance capacity when that balloon payment is due.
But the balloon payments are all 18 years.
Yeah,
So
the balloon payments are 18 years, although for non-RAD deals, they're typically 10 or 12.
Sure. All right.
So I'm just going to point out that under risk share, it's 17.
Yeah, so there's a waiver that can be granted for the RAD process. So you're exactly right. There are some 17-year. And recap is looking at ways to handle generally the balloon payment item. So, but they would definitely waive it for the risk share years that have been done. They've waived that on those cases. All right, no more hands raised, no more questions, so we'll kick it over to Scott next. Of course.
All right, well, hello, everyone. I probably know some of you out there. Others of you likely don't know me. I'm Scott Kuhl. I'm one of the underwriter branch chiefs in the Chicago regional office. I have a small team of underwriters who handle some tax credit and RAD transactions. I did a few RAD deals as a senior underwriter a couple of years ago. I also served as transaction manager for a while in conjunction with FHA underwriting. So I have a little bit of experience from both sides, for better or worse. And so I've been asked to come and provide some RAD advice, I guess it's my pun for the day, for you all. So these are just some tips that I have for you for underwriting RAD FHA transactions. So this portion is really directed towards those FHA multifamily senior underwriters in each of the regions who we are attempting to have designated as RAD underwriters. Okay, so just to recap, so why are we doing this? So as Robert explained, RAD is an important preservation tool, and many projects that are converting under RAD have these extensive capital needs. PHAs now have access to debt and equity to finance capital improvements and preserve these properties. FHA multifamily mortgage insurance is an important source of debt financing for RAD projects, so we are trying to provide streamlined access to FHA. So FHA has developed some specific underwriting guidance to accommodate these deals. So who's going to be doing it? So the goal here is to have RAD designated senior underwriters in each of our 5 regions who've been trained and have the expertise to underwrite these transactions. So You, as the RAD designated senior underwriters, will be operating under the single underwriter model as usual, with technical support as necessary from our specialists. You will be coordinating with the RAD transaction manager, as Pat explained, and we will still be utilizing workload sharing as necessary, but the hope is that we will not have to rely on it as much as we currently have been. For the past couple years, we've had basically 3 what we've called RAD D4 processing centers. So the Atlanta office, the Chicago office, and the Fort Worth office have a few folks who were trained a bit on RAD FHA underwriting a couple years ago, and we've been primarily handling the majority of the RAD deals that come in for an FHA D4. So we've been having to utilize workload sharing since we only had 3 offices processing those deals. Now that we've transformed and we are under this new regional structure with 5 regions, I think the goal now is to have a small group of senior underwriters in each of the 5 regions who are capable of underwriting these deals as they come in for the states that your region oversees. Well, we can still utilize workload sharing as we need to, but we want to have regional expertise. Okay. All right. So what types of deals will you see? So Robert kind of explained the difference between component 1 and component 2. So what you're mostly going to be seeing is component 1 public housing deals that have a CHAP. There could be a few component 2 deals come in, but those are going to be few and far between. So for this training, we're really going to focus on component 1 public housing. Okay, so of those projects that are pursuing FHA insured debt financing, which is essentially right now it looks like 15% of the deals that have closed have utilized FHA. You're going to be seeing those applications submitted under a couple sections of the Act. The majority, it sounds like about 80% of them will be D4 sub-rehabs. And under RAD, those can actually all go direct to firm. There does not have to be a pre-application. Some will be 223Fs, about 20%, and those could be what we call heavy Fs or moderate rehabs. And some may actually even be cash out, where the PHA is pulling out equity and using it to fund other conversions and rehabs in their portfolio. And then there could be a few projects that may actually, public housing projects that may actually be demolished and constructed new under D4 as well. But I think most of what you're going to see is D4 sub-rehabs with a few Fs. Tax credits. So a large portion of the RAD FHA projects that you all are going to see will have 9 or 4% tax credits. It looks like about 40% of the overall RAD portfolio is receiving tax credit equity. I would venture to guess that perhaps more than 40% of the ones that go FHA actually have tax credits. So a significant portion of what you see will have tax credits. I just wanted to note that RAD deals with tax credits generally are not going to be eligible for expedited processing under the forthcoming tax credit pilot expansion. I think the notice has been drafted, and I believe the goal is to have those go through the standard processing track, but I think that could be subject to change until that's published. But I just want to clarify that for today's training, we're not going to focus on tax credit underwriting per se. This is really just a RAD underwriting training. So I think the majority of you who are going to be underwriting RAD deals are also our senior underwriters who underwrite tax credit and pilot deals, and a lot of you probably attended the tax credit underwriting workshop that we had here in DC with Liz a couple months ago. So you learned kind of our current guidance during that training, but if you were not there, I would just urge you to refer to Chapter 14 of the new MAP guide for our current tax credit guidance. Okay, so what do you need to know? So what's different on a RAD deal? What's the same? So first, just a quick overview. So first and foremost, I just want to state that these are standard MAP deals. So the 2016 MAP guide applies. These are essentially Section 8 deals with a few twists. The underwriting of RAD deals is going to mirror the underwriting of other Section 8 assisted properties with certain allowances that have been made to accommodate RAD transactions. I'm going to assume that the majority of the RAD deals that you'll see will have at least 90% of the units that will be receiving Section 8 assistance, so they will likely qualify for the affordable underwriting treatment in the MAP guide as well as the broadly affordable MIP. But where you should start is start by reading the RAD FHA underwriting notice. If you didn't know about it, it's Housing Notice 2012-20, came out in calendar year 2012. It's basically the notice that has all of the policy guidance for underwriting RAD deals. There's also a subsequent FAQ that I believe used to be available on the MAP homepage. I checked last week and I didn't see it there anymore, so we can circulate it after this training. But I would say that the first thing that you should do as a RAD designated senior underwriter is start by reading this notice. Take an hour or two, read through it. We're not going to go through everything today. I'll touch on a few high points, but that's really your homework, I think. And then I'm basically just going to go through a few tips and lessons learned. But one thing to know is that all RAD deals qualify for one-stage applications, so they're all direct to firm for all sections of the Act, including D4, unless the lender requests a two-stage application. And as Robert explained, all of these RAD projects will carry a RAD use agreement, which will be superior to all other liens, including the FHA closing docs. It'll be coterminous with the initial HAP contract. It will automatically renew upon extension or renewal of the HAP. That's the shall or will language that HUD will offer and the owner will accept. And it remains in effect if the HAP is abated or terminated. So this is really the essence of the flexibilities that we've provided to accommodate RAD deals. It's due to the existence of this RAD use agreement and essentially the Section 8 really in perpetuity. So what to expect and some things to consider. So I'm going to go through a few general underwriting requirements and then just some lessons learned from the field. I'm going to structure this as sort of the Dan Sullivan, as you know, likes to talk about the 5 C's of underwriting. I think there are a lot more than 5, so I'm going to go through the 5 that I've picked. But the first, I'm just going to generally categorize as collateral. So I wanted to first mention that scattered site projects are very common on RAD deals we've found as PHAs are converting their portfolios. I just want to iterate that that FHA's scattered site policies and the MAP guide apply. You need to make sure that if we're going to do a scattered site deal that we have one marketable, manageable real estate entity. And as always, we have to have at least 5 units per parcel or a combination of contiguous parcels. So you're going to need to use your underwriting judgment when you look at a concept package that is proposing a scattered site transaction. And some of the factors that you should consider are physical distance between the properties. It may depend on whether it's urban or rural. The physical condition, construction type, and age of the properties. They should be relatively similar. We don't want some high-rise towers of a certain condition and age grouped with some low-rise walk-ups of another condition and age in one loan. Those should really be separate. So we need to be able to analyze the long-term capital needs and size the R for R appropriately with one CNA. So if one CNA can't do it, we really shouldn't be doing it as one loan. It should be broken up. So we've had a couple concept meetings where we've actually asked the lender to split up the deals into 2 or 3 separate loans because we didn't feel that they were appropriate as scattered sites. Not to say that we can't do them, but just as something to look at and refer to Chapter 3.1 of the MAP Guide for the guidance on it. Okay, so just generally, typical public housing, what you might see. So these projects, they could be built in the 50s, 60s, 70s. They could be a family, 1 to 2 story, CMU or wood frame with brick veneer building with a asphalt shingled roof, or it could be an elderly mid to high rise with flat roofs. I just provided a couple of examples The first one here is, if you can see it, this is just a family one-story duplex in Gastonia that our team is currently, Gastonia, North Carolina, that our team is currently underwriting for the Southeast region. Precast concrete with brick veneer, Bruce asphalt shingles, construction in 1970. Isn't it beautiful? So I think this is probably, a good example of typical public housing. The second one, this is a deal that I actually did a couple years ago. It's an elderly high-rise in Cleveland, Ohio, 22-story concrete and steel frame, flat roof, built in 1971. Also a very, very attractive building. But another example of a type of public housing that you might see. So, some common problems that you may encounter with public housing projects may include, while they may be well built, they're generally old and they might have lead-based paint and or asbestos. They could have worn mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems. Watch out for functional and market obsolescence. Floor plans that perhaps don't work. Too few or small baths, closets, kitchens, and they may not be very energy efficient. So we're going to have extensive capital needs in the aging public housing stock, and we're likely going to see a lot of sub-rehabs, and as I mentioned, in some cases, a few will be demolishing and replacing the building. CNA and Davis-Bacon. So currently, all RAD deals, I believe, still have an RPCA, which is a RAD physical condition assessment, which is slightly more stringent than a standard PCNA that you're used to receiving. It requires, I believe, an energy audit and I think some green recommendations. So this is actually a RAD requirement in the RAD notice. If you, on a D4 application, do not receive a copy of the RPCA, I would go ahead and ask the lender or the RAD transaction manager for a copy. And hopefully, on any older project, they're going to be doing some intrusive testing for some of the systems. So I would look for that as well. And then I believe as of, Tom, is that right? As of October 1st, the CNA e-tool becomes required.
Exactly.
And so I assume that all RAD transactions will also be switching over to the CNA e-tool, like will be required for all FHA applications. So some of those might start coming in before October 1st, but as of after October 1st, I believe they'll all be submitted under the CNA e-tool. Reiterating what Robert said about Davis-Bacon. Davis-Bacon is required for all initial RAD repairs for PHAs. So even if the FHA transaction is a 223F where Davis-Bacon would not typically be required, RAD still requires it for all initial RAD repairs. So wage requirements will be applicable. Some other things to consider on the AEC side. Accessibility, like other deals, I would consider engaging your construction analyst to review Fair Housing Act compliance and other accessibility issues. If the FHA application is sort of a heavy 223F, a mod rehab, where they're doing a lot of work, I would be careful of the two systems test. Check to make sure that it doesn't trigger a sub-rehab. If it is a sub-rehab, we want to see a healthy construction contingency, 10 to 15%. And then a quick note on relocation, there's a RAD relocation notice that I've referenced here. I believe URA applies for all RAD deals, relocation for all RAD deals, and relocation activities generally should not begin prior to closing. Okay, moving on to the category that I'm just going to call cash flow and appraisal. So first, let's talk about appraisals for RAD deals, because this is one of the significant changes. So under RAD, the property is to be appraised based on how it will operate as an assisted project with Section 8 rents. So some of the challenges in appraising RAD deals are the selection of comparable subsidized sales and rent comps, and the analysis of the project's historical operating expenses. But some of this is offset by the fact that the subsidized rents are set in the CHAP that we'll receive, and the project essentially has a guaranteed income stream. So we're going to, I guess, talk about loan sizing, and then we'll kind of back into rents and expenses. But loan sizing for RAD FHA deals. So for a 223F, the Criterion 3 value estimate under RAD is based on the restricted NOI due to the existence of this RAD use agreement and the rent restrictions. It's not based on market as it usually is on a 223F. So this is the flexibility that was provided for RAD deals. So this is one of the biggest changes. So if we should be using the RAD Section 8 rents via the CHAP for the Criterion 3 value, and consequently NOI for Criteria 3 and 5 could actually be the same or similar. On a D4 sub-rehab, similarly, as is value, which is based on true market, which is what prospective purchasers would be willing to pay based on the property's current condition, and assuming any limits on rent or NOI. In this case, this is the CHAP rents. So the appraiser should be using the CHAP rents and the historical occupancy and operating expenses if they're available as well for the D4 sub-rehab as is value. Criterion 5, your debt service underwriting is based on restricted post-rehab rents and expenses. Again, the CHAP rents. We can actually underwrite at above market Section 8 rents for the full loan term. So a second tranche, a B piece in a bifurcated mortgage for the Section 8 rent overhang, if it exists, is not required on RAD deals. So you can just underwrite the RAD rents for the full term under Criterion 5. So again, so the rents on a RAD deal are set by the CHAP. The Exhibit A to the CHAP lays out the contract rents. The lenders should be utilizing these rents in their underwriting. If they don't, we should be rejecting the application until they fix that. If you don't receive a copy of the CHAP in the application because it's not really a standard FHA application exhibit, sometimes they sneak it in there in the narrative or other locations. If you have trouble finding it or if you didn't receive it, I would ask the lender for it, or you can always get it from your RAD transaction manager. The way it works is that the remainder of the calendar year in which the HAP contract becomes effective is actually still funded from public housing, and then the HAP kicks in, I think, January 1st of the following year. Units that are vacant during rehab may be eligible for rental assistance payments or RAP. So if you have questions about that, I would talk to your transaction manager because I believe they're determining whether the project is eligible for RAP. And then the HAP contract will automatically be renewed at the end of the contract term. On the expense side, so expense analysis is really important on a RAD deal. So PHAs often will only have consolidated financial statements for the PHA itself or their specific AMPs. I think their asset management project, I believe, is the acronym. It could be groups of individual projects in an AMP. A lot of times the CHAP name ties to the AMP name, but it may not necessarily be our specific project. It may be one piece of an AMP. So we don't always have project-specific historical operating data. So you're going to want to review the appraiser's estimates of the subsidized expenses, comparable subsidized properties in the portfolio, and then the PHA's historical operating expenses, which you or the lender may have to prorate. But you know, these are as-is expenses, not post-rehab, and the property may operate differently moving forward. Underwritten expenses that are less than historic expenses may be acceptable. Some costs may have been inflated due to PHA operations, high overhead, inefficient utilities, etc. But the lender should be justifying any departures from historic numbers. And then actually straight out of the RAD underwriting notice, I just wanted to read this to you. It said the lenders must take care when underwriting expenses for RAD transactions, in particular for public housing, which is converting from a distinct management and funding model. As a result, expenses in proposed underwriting may be lower than historical operating expenses, particularly if the borrower is proposing changes in management or oversight as part of the conversion. The underwriting expenses must be shown to be achievable based on comparison of historical and borrower budgeted projects, considering the potential efficiencies from proposed repairs, and considering similar subsidized properties. All right, we're going to move on to tax abatements. Tax abatements and payments in lieu of taxes are going to be common on many PHA RAD deals. We can recognize the tax abatements and exclude them from the taxes from operating expenses if the abatement runs with the land, and we can actually grant a waiver if it runs with the owner on a tax credit deal, or if the lessor is a governmental body, if the PHA is leasing the real estate to our borrower. For PHA conversions with pilots, the borrower has to provide a legal opinion that the pilot will continue post-closing. And I suggest that you refer to Chapter 7.16 of the MAP Guide for more guidance on tax payments. Touching on ownership and control and lease structures, Robert explained that RAD requires that PHAs retain certain ownership and control of their converting projects. And as you know, in FHA, we require a single asset entity mortgagor. So what we typically see on deals that come to us is that if it's a non-tax credit transaction, the PHA will likely transfer a fee simple ownership to an affiliated entity where the PHA is the sole owner or member, or to another public or nonprofit entity. If it's a tax credit transaction, the PHA will either transfer ownership to the tax credit entity, it's usually a limited partnership, or in some cases an LLC, and the PHA or one of its affiliates will be the GP or the managing member in the tax credit partnership. Or the PHA will retain fee simple ownership and will lease the real estate to the tax credit entity via a long-term lease. So long-term leases we've found have been pretty common on the RAD deals that we've received from PHAs with tax credits. So the PHA can retain that ownership and control and also still retain their tax exemption. So what you may see is a single upfront lease payment and or below market rent, and the PHA may take back a seller note for the single upfront payment for purposes of generating tax credit acquisition basis. So if you have a leasehold, the project interests that should be appraised in the appraisal are fee simple and leased fee, and this can get rather complicated, but I urge you to refer to Chapter 7.15 for our leasehold valuation guidance. And if you have questions or need help, I would suggest requesting technical assistance from your local HUD appraiser. Just another note that OGC has to review and approve all lease structures and any related waivers. So this is a process that I would recommend that you begin early. You may receive a request to waive HUD's purchase option and the HUD lease addendum. We do allow this for affordable deals when the fee simple owner and lessor is a public entity, such in the case of the PHA, but it requires a waiver and needs to be reviewed. And then sometimes the HUD lease addendum will require some other technical modifications to clarify what exactly is being leased, whether it's land only, land and improvements, and all of that needs to be reviewed by OGC as well, because there are only limited changes, modifications to the HUD lease addendum that are required that we can approve locally. Other things have to go to headquarters for approval. So we've learned the hard way just to start that process early whenever you have a lease involved. Okay, the next section I'm going to refer to as the capacity and competency of the development team. So this is an important area on RAD deals. Most PHAs don't have previous FHA multifamily experience, so it's critical that you as the FHA underwriter really assess the development team's ability to execute the transaction, complete the rehab on time, meet any tax credit timelines, and operate the property efficiently moving forward. So some things that you're going to want to look at are, Are they bringing in a fee developer or a development consultant, or is the PHA, doing this themselves? Do they have a very experienced GC, or is it someone that the PHA, maybe likes to work with and has often worked with in the past, and that's kind of their go-to contractor? Is there going to be a third-party management agent with specific multifamily experience, or is the PHA going to continue to self-manage the property? Some PHAs may have in-house development and management staff who have the skills and experience necessary to manage this process and carry out the project, and others may not. And if tax credits are involved, that adds another additional layer of complexities. So, have they done tax credit deals before? That's that question you want to ask. So the lender should be demonstrating to you at the concept meeting that there's a cohesive, competent development team with recent successful experience in all of these aspects, all these facets of the development and management. And if the team does not have sufficient relevant experience, you should be requiring that they bolster the development team, either through a development consultant, a more experienced GC, or maybe even bringing in a third-party management agent. We learned this the hard way on one or two transactions. We had a project that actually missed its tax credit deadlines, and so this is something that we are looking much more closely at now, and I would urge you all to do the same. So this is an important conversation that you want to have at the concept meeting, and don't hesitate to stand your ground if you think that the team that they're proposing is not capable of carrying out the transaction. And then just the mortgage credit review of PHAs. It's similar to other nonprofit sponsored affordable transactions. It's generally going to be limited to the sponsor entities, the PHA itself or its affiliates, not individual members. The PHA will receive the full credit and financial review, but the PHA and its wholly owned affiliates are actually exempt from 2530, so they don't have to receive 2530 approval. And then there's going to be a limited credit and financial review of the key principals. We're really treating them more like nonprofit board members. So Chapter 8 of the MAP Guide talks about that. Okay, the next section, capital structure. So some common sources of funds on RAD FHA transactions that you will see in addition to the FHA loan are, the biggest one is probably tax credit equity. Again, refer to Chapter 14 for our tax credit requirements, equity pans, etc. PHAs often will contribute, as Robert mentioned, public housing capital and or operating funds as sources to complete the conversions and the rehabs of particular properties in their portfolios that they're converting under RAD. They often structure these as notes and seller notes for acquisition or lease single upfront payments. So seller take-back financing is a common practice to boost acquisition basis for tax credits. We'll see seller notes a lot as well. And then sometimes there will be other soft funds or deferred developer fee. We already talked about tax credit equity. Go to Chapter 14. Secondary financing. Chapter 8.9 of the MAP Guide lays out all the secondary financing requirements. As you know, a PHA is considered a public entity, and so it's considered public debt. And as are PHA seller take-back loans are considered coming from a government source as well. So they're treated as public debt. Developer fees. Refer to Appendix 3B of the MAP Guide for limits on developer fees. They can be mortgageable so long as BSPRA or SPRA are not also included. If it's a tax credit deal, we just go with what the allocating agency allows. If it's a non-tax credit deal, developer fees limited to 10% of the total budget, less acquisition reserves and the developer fee. For D4 sub-rehab projects where there's an identity of interest between the borrower and the GC, the developer fee is interchangeable with BISPRA. They can have one or the other, but not both. And then consultant fees are allowed, and those are actually paid out of the developer fee. Okay, so my fifth C is just the importance of the concept meeting and the closing process. So again, I would suggest that you have a concept meeting for all RAD FHA deals, regardless of size or section of the act. You guys in each of your regions can figure out what process you want to put in place for that, but I suggest that one of your regional RAD designated senior underwriters or a branch chief there be present at the concept meeting, and you should always attempt to invite your RAD transaction manager. If you don't know who the TM is at the time you receive a concept package, contact Ms. Burke, and Pat will let you know who the assigned TM is. Obviously the lender will be there, and oftentimes the PHA or developer will be in attendance as well. So some potential topics that you will want to discuss with the lender at the concept meeting are the development team, their experience and capacity, any unique ownership and lease structures. You can consider inviting OGC to the concept meeting if that's something they would like to do and get involved with that early on in the process. If you have a lease, discuss any scattered sites, the rehab scope of work, the plan for relocation, just the overall underwriting and how it's going to be appraised. So you can make sure that that's done properly. If there are tax credits, any issues, deadlines related to tax credits, secondary financing, any specific RAD issues that your transaction manager may bring up, and then any waiver requests. And I'm sure there are others, but these are just some general topics that I would try to touch on your concept meetings for RAD deals. And then just some steps during the process, the underwriting phase. Let Pat know when you've received an FHA application for a RAD deal, and send her that PIC number that she was talking about that's on the CHAP. And you may have to go hunting for that again. So if you don't see the CHAP, ask the lender for it or the TM. You'll be coordinating with the transaction manager throughout the process, working with your folks in asset management. If they're converting to PBRA, the account executive will actually be the contract administrator, I believe. And then you'll be working with OGC, of course, during the closing phase, but possibly earlier if leases or waivers are involved. The deal will go to RAD Approval Committee, then you'll go to FHA Loan Committee if necessary. I think when we first started doing RAD FHA deals, we said that all of them should go to your, well, back then it was hub, but now it's a regional loan committee. I don't know that we're really doing that anymore necessarily, Tom, but I think probably just the standard loan committee thresholds apply for RAD deals.
Yeah.
So they don't all have to go to regional loan committee, but some will and some may have to go to national. But generally, I think the two committees, you know, while the flow chart showed that, you know, RAD Approval Committee happens first, then FHA Loan Committee, a lot of times they're sort of happening simultaneously. It's just that I think that the FHA firm commitment actually gets issued first, and you should be adding a special condition to your firm, basically that it's dependent upon issuance of the RCC, the RAD conversion commitment. So condition your firm upon issuance of the RCC. So we're not going to close unless that happens, and then the RCC will get issued shortly after. Closings. So we're going to have two of them going on at the same time. So the RAD TM and the RAD closing attorney are going to be handling the RAD closing side. They'll be converting the project from public housing to Section 8, releasing the PHA from the annual contributions contract. That's what it's for, right? And the declaration of trust, which is essentially what's currently preventing them from going out and getting debt and equity. And they'll be executing the RAD use agreement and the Section 8 HAP contract. And then our FHA loan closing will be happening at the same time, and that's basically the same process that you're used to. But your TM may be in touch, and if they need anything, get them what they need, and likewise. Okay, so just some more resources. Here's sort of the applicable policy guidance. Again, the RAD FHA underwriting notice, 2012-20. I would read it, familiarize yourselves with it. The RAD notice, the third revision came out this year. So it's Housing Notice 2017-03. Oh,
I just want to add, Scott, on the map guide you have there is the guidance from July 5th, 2016 guidance on the map guide.
Oh, the administrative memo and the epic.
Color to valuation.
It's true. Yeah, so Tom Brunasiak's in the room, and he pointed out that not only should you utilize obviously the map guide, but the administrative memo and I believe the FAQs that came out with the issuance of the 2016 map guide have some appraisal guidance in them that may apply to affordable and RAD transactions. So I would refer to those as well. Some online RAD resources, just the RAD website, the RAD resource desk, which Robert mentioned. Sounds like he may walk through it with you. And there is a RAD FHA mailbox. I'm not sure. There used to be. I don't know if anyone is monitoring it, but perhaps that's something we'll.
I didn't know.
Okay. Well, Pat has a new job. She's now the RAD FHA mailbox administrator.
Yeah, then I
Okay. Well, don't send anything to it yet, but she'll let you know when you can. And then just our contact information. I listed Robert for any RAD questions. Pat, she's sort of the RAD FHA liaison for any coordination process questions, and then I put Tom and myself down for any underwriting questions. So, I guess we'll see.
So a couple of those, I'm looking to see if we get any questions, but a couple things before we jump to that. I wanted to reiterate two things that Scott mentioned in his presentation. Great presentation, Scott, by the way. Very, very well done. But just a reminder to all the FHA underwriters and everybody, the RAD conversion process is the time to set these properties up for success. So throughout Scott's presentation, he sprinkled it with, this is important to think about and this is important to look at. And I would just say that the development team, make sure you're comfortable with the development team as you're doing this underwriting. This is the time to make those changes. Management, who's going to be doing the management, if something needs to change. The capital needs assessment, the PCA, whatever your term of art is that you're looking at, make sure that the property's needs are getting covered and that they're setting it up with proper reserves. If you are uncomfortable as an FHA underwriter with some of the work that's being done, and you look at the property and it was built in 1940 and it's had one major renovation done in 1980, it's time. Something needs to be done, and if they're not doing enough work, push back. That is the expectation in this underwriting process. This is the time for them to take care of that. One of the questions that just came up was, who performs a subsidy layering review in a RAD conversion involving public housing funds, 221D4, and LIHTC? Well, if it's LIHTC, then the tax credit authority is charged with the subsidy layering review. RAD requires a RAD subsidy layering review in all transactions. If you go back to Pat's slides, one of the items was that there's subsidy layering review done on every transaction. But just to make sure that everyone on the phone is clear, that is not a HUD subsidy layering review. There's no approval. There's no subsidy layering approval that you could hand to somebody from the RAD perspective. The RAD transaction managers do a subsidy layering review to see if they find something, but the onus is on someone else if there's a need for that documentation. And in a LIHTC transaction, that would be the tax credit authority. Each state has a different way of doing it. Some states require it at submission of the application and closing of the financing. Some require it at the time of completion of work. So you just never know. But the RAD program itself has a subsidy layering tool that the TMs use for those. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see who else we got here. Anticipate identifying RAD underwriters, West region.
Yeah, so I think names were, Shannon, I think names were sent in to Monique a month or two ago with some names of some underwriters in each of the regions that had been designated to be the RAD underwriters. I don't have those names, and I hope that the invitation was sent out to all of them, but I'm sure we can find out who they are. But I think someone probably sent something in for your office, Shannon.
Next question on mortgage credit. What is the risk trade-off for the PHA's exemption from being vetted through the 2530 process? How about net worth? So I'll let Scott answer more specifically, but the general response is PHAs are exempt from 2530, period, because of their existence as a public housing authority and the determination by HUD that they are a approved government agency already, so public body. So they in and of themselves are exempt. So I don't know the rest of the question, but that's the comfort that's been provided.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll be getting financial statements, credit reports, other mortgage credit information on the PHA, but they just are exempt from 2530, and that's kind of all. That's kind of it.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing is on a LIHTC transaction, I mean, they're self-contained. I mean, there usually isn't a lot of additional equity outside of the credits coming to that transaction. So when we underwrite them, we look at those sources as compared to the uses to make sure that there's a balance, number one. And if the underwriting itself, the Section 8 contract going forward as rates and expenses is conservative, sufficiently conservative that we'll get there.
Great. PHAs report a cost allocation shown as a percentage for each unit on their PHA. FAS. Since these are not a direct crosswalk to FHA transactions, what level of detail on the financial statements do you recommend we obtain in order to validate any changes to expenses in the appraisal? Not including the FAS detail on unit cost, is this a consideration for the future? Scott is contemplating his answer. Tom is contemplating his answer.
Well, so the question is, let's make sure we understand the question. So we're saying that the historical expenses would be greater. We're saying because they'd be greater than ongoing expenses post.
I think the questioner is saying that it's in FAS and it's different and there's no direct allocation. And so if you've got a PHA that is allocating costs across multiple properties, and there's not particularly aligned to one property that's coming through your FHA underwriting, how do you approach
yeah,
that?
I mean,
right?
I think prorating it by unit is the only way that I would know to approach it, really.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is there's where we would want to look at and rely on comps in the appraisal and also our own comps.
So comps would be, okay.
That's right. You're looking at the detailed expense costs.
Okay.
Credible expense costs.
Okay. How frequently and by what degree of historical expense figures differ from projected expenses? And how often and to what degree has the FHA underwriter suggested that proposed expenses be altered?
Probably all the time.
Right, yeah, pretty regularly, right?
Yeah.
Differ.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be a case-by-case scenario,
Yeah.
but I don't know if I have a percentage or.
And I think that would go back to Tom's earlier response about comps. I think it's going to be more important to look at comps in these situations,
I
right?
mean,
Yep.
you see those, the mismatch of expenses,
Right.
See the project.
What criterion usually governs the FHA mortgage sizing?
I think a lot of our D4s are limited by criterion 5. That's why this expense analysis and the debt service underwriting is important. But I think we've had some Fs that have been limited by value.
So I don't see any more questions. Did want to take a second. If I could type. Did want to take a quick second and show everybody who hasn't seen it what the RAD resource desk looks like. So again, it was in Scott's presentation, the radresource.net. If you haven't gotten a login, there's an FHA user type, FHA underwriter user type. You can send your submissions through, and I'll just confirm them with Scott or whomever just to make sure. But it provides a lot of information for you to the extent that you want it. But just to give you a sense of what lives on the resource desk, this is where all of the transactions that are coming through for RAD conversion are processed by the recap office. And so all information about basic information about the transaction, and then the various milestones that they have to meet, and then the financing plan is reviewed by the transaction manager on this page. It's also submitted by the PHA on this page. So all of the various requirements are listed on the grid, whatever they've uploaded to fulfill that requirement, and then oftentimes you'll see PHAs and transaction managers communicating through their web portal as the review is happening. So this is kind of the tool that the recap office uses in their processing. If it was an FHA transaction, the FHA underwriter could see this same information. They couldn't comment or provide any dates or anything, but you could see everything that was put here. So,
are the FHA underwriters getting access to specific projects, or do they just have access to the general
they can
library?
get specific access depending if you have some of your staff that are asking for it every once in a while. So yes.
How do they ask for access?
So they can log in. That they can ask for a login.
Yeah.
So you can request a login as a new user.
Okay.
Type in information, say who you are, submit the information. We get an email. Then if I don't know the person, then I circulate it around to find out who does and who can approve their level of access.
Thank you.
So Scott obviously already has access because he's had it before, but yes, each FHA underwriter can have access to the specific transaction if they want it. So.
Can you show the underwriters like the document library?
Sure.
Resources?
Yep. And this, in fact, will be where this webinar is posted for people to review. But so there's a document library on the resource desk that provides various guidance for all sorts of, you've got some FHA and RAD information already on here. If I can find that. Here's RAD FHA tools. There are a variety of documents and items. There's also a section on webinars, which I'll just go to. So all the webinars that are posted on the resource desk are here. This is where this one will show up. So depending on what level of access you have, you can get different ones. So FHA underwriters would have information that's specifically tailored to FHA, as well as any other general information that recap is designated for those folks. So it's a nice resource for kind of all things RAD for you all to get information for. See if we have any more questions. Nobody's raising their hand. Oh, there we have a hand. Shannon.
Yes, I'm here.
Excellent. We're ready for you. You have a question?
Oh, no, my question was answered. It was the identification of underwriters in the West region.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
I don't think this person can ask a question. Laura, I'm not sure that you can ask a question, but we'll try here. Nope. Yep, you can. Laura, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to say it would be great to collaborate with you across the enterprise on the RAD resource net. So who should I talk to about that, maybe as a follow-up?
You're breaking up a little bit. You're coordinating what?
Accessing radresource.net on the enterprise network, such as Opus or some other source.
Yeah, so there's no way to yeah, so the RAD resource desk is available through the web, not through Opus or anything like that. So if you want access to the resource desk and you're not an FHA underwriter and you just want general access, just submit a request for general HUD access, and we'll circle back and get you the right access that you need. That make sense?
Thank you.
Yep. All right. I don't see any other questions or hand raised. Tom, anything else from your end?
No, I think that was pretty complete.
No, shall we be saying goodbye?
I don't have anything else. So
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Scott, for a very detailed underwriting presentation, and Robert, and let me know if anyone has any questions.
thanks,
You have
everyone.
to let Pat know when you get those applications.
Right.
Give her
and
those PIC numbers.
PIC numbers. Send them in.